It was just a wedding photograph. A bride and groom side by side in 1894, their faces frozen in time. At first glance, it seems like an ordinary wedding portrait of the time. Formal, serene, nothing special. But look closely. Look at her hands. The bride's hands tell a story that words never could. Scars, deep, deliberate marks etched into her skin. What happened to this woman? Why is she standing next to a man who, according to all the laws and customs of the time, should never have married her? And why did someone hide this photograph for over 130 years? This is not just a wedding photo. It is proof. Proof of something that should never have been seen. Proof of a secret so dangerous that it could have cost them both their lives. Today, we finally discover the truth. If stories like this move you, take a second to subscribe and hit the like button, because what comes next will change how you see American history. The demolition crew was supposed to arrive on Monday. By Friday, the house would be nothing but rubble and memory. 11 years of legal battles, unpaid taxes, and bureaucratic neglect had finally sealed its fate. The Victorian mansion at the end of Oakwood Road in Natchez, Mississippi, once a symbol of wealth and southern grandeur, would disappear forever. Helen first saw the house on a humid afternoon in late August 2023. She worked as a senior archivist for the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and she had volunteered to lead the final documentation effort before the demolition. It was routine work, the kind she had done dozens of times. Photograph the rooms, catalog any remaining artifacts, file the paperwork, move on. But this house felt different. The moment she stepped onto the warped porch, something shifted in the air. The smell of rot and age hung heavy, mixing with the distant sweetness of magnolia blossoms. Inside, the walls were streaked with water damage, and the floorboards groaned beneath her boots. Furniture lay toppled and broken, left behind by whoever had lived here last. An old woman named Dorothy, according to the county records. She had died alone in 2012, with no children, no siblings, no one to claim her belongings. Helen moved through the first floor methodically, her camera clicking in the silence. Parlor, dining room, kitchen? Nothing remarkable, just the ordinary debris of a life ended and forgotten. It was the attic that changed everything. The stairs leading up were narrow and treacherous, several steps missing entirely. Helen climbed carefully, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The attic was cramped and suffocating, the air thick with dust that made her eyes water. Broken furniture, stacks of moldy newspapers, a child's rocking horse with one missing leg, and in the far corner, half buried beneath a collapsed shelf, a small leather trunk. Helen knelt beside it. The leather had cracked and peeled with age, but the brass latches still held. She worked them open slowly, her fingers trembling with an anticipation she could not explain. Inside, wrapped in layers of brittle newspaper dated 1932, was a photograph. She lifted it into the light. A wedding portrait, a white man in a dark suit, a black woman in a simple white dress, and a date inscribed at the bottom, 1894. Helen's heart stopped. Helen did not sleep that night. She sat at her desk in Jackson, the photograph propped against her computer monitor, unable to look away. The faces stared back at her. The groom with his jaw set in quiet defiance, the bride with her chin lifted, her eyes carrying something that looked almost like triumph. But it was the hands that haunted her. Under her magnifying glass, the details became undeniable. The bride's hands, folded gently at her waist, bore a network of scars. Thick, ropey marks that crisscrossed her palms and circled her wrists. These were not the scars of accident or illness. They were the scars of bondage, of rope burns and shackles, of tools gripped until flesh tore and healed and tore again. Helen had studied photographs of formerly enslaved people. She recognized the patterns. But the Civil War had ended in 1865, nearly 30 years before this wedding portrait was taken. By 1894, the woman in this photograph should have been free. She should have been living without chains, without masters, without the brutal labor that left such permanent marks. So, why did she still bear fresh wounds? The next morning, Helen contacted James, a historian at Howard University who specialized in post-Reconstruction Southern history. She sent him high-resolution scans of the photograph and waited. His response came within 2 hours. "Where did you find this?" she explained. "The abandoned house, the leather trunk, the newspaper wrapping dated 1932. "Helen," James said slowly, "I think I know what we're looking at. Those scars are consistent with something called debt peonage. After the war, many plantation owners used legal tricks to keep black workers trapped on their land. Sharecropping contracts with impossible terms, fabricated debts that could never be repaid, vagrancy laws that criminalized unemployment. The workers were technically free, but they couldn't leave. They were beaten if they tried to escape. Some were worked to death." Helen looked at the photograph again. The bride's hands, the groom standing beside her. "But she married him," Helen said. "She married the son of her captors." "That's what we need to understand," James replied. Who was she? Who was he? And how did they end up standing together in that photograph? The search for answers had begun. The trail began with property records. Helen spent the next 2 weeks buried in the Natchez courthouse archives, pulling deed transfers, tax filings, and census records that stretched back to before the Civil War. The Victorian house on Oakwood Road had been built in 1887 by a family that had relocated from Virginia after the war. Before 1865, they had owned a sprawling cotton plantation and over 300 enslaved people. After emancipation, the family sold their Virginia land and moved south to Mississippi, where they purchased new acreage and rebuilt their fortune through sharecropping. The patriarch, a stern man named Cornelius, ran the operation with an iron fist. His 3 sons managed the daily labor, collecting debts, enforcing contracts, and ensuring that the workers who lived on the land could never afford to leave. In the 1870 census, Helen found a list of laborers living on the property. Among them was a girl named Eliza, 12 years old, listed as colored and employed as a domestic worker. By 1880, Eliza was still there, now 22, still classified as a servant, still bound to the same family that had once owned her ancestors. But in the 1900 census, everything changed. Eliza was no longer listed as a servant. She appeared as the wife of Thomas, the youngest son of Cornelius. They had 2 children, a boy named Samuel and a girl named Grace, both classified as mulatto. Helen sat back, her pulse racing. The bride in the photograph was Eliza. The groom was Thomas, and somehow, impossibly, they had married. They had started a family. They had defied every law and custom that should have destroyed them both. But the 1900 census was taken 6 years after the wedding photograph. What had happened in between? How had this union survived in a world designed to crush it? Helen needed to find the family's private papers. According to county records, the documents had been donated to the Natchez Historical Society in 1978 by a distant relative who wanted nothing to do with the family's legacy. The papers had been sitting in storage ever since, untouched and uncatalogued. Helen made the call that afternoon. The Natchez Historical Society operated out of a converted antebellum home on Pearl Street, its rooms lined with shelves of deteriorating documents and forgotten artifacts. The curator, an elderly man named Walter, led Helen to a basement storage room where 12 cardboard boxes sat stacked against the wall. "Nobody's touched these in 40 years, Walter said. "Good luck." Helen began her work. The boxes contained a chaotic mixture of personal letters, legal documents, business receipts, and family photographs. She organized them by date, photographing each page and building a timeline of the family's post-war activities. The letters revealed the daily operations of their sharecropping enterprise: crop yields, equipment purchases, complaints about lazy workers. In the 3rd box, she found what she was searching for: a bundle of labor contracts, tied together with a faded ribbon. The contracts were printed forms with handwritten entries: names, dates, terms of employment. Each one followed the same pattern. A worker would sign an agreement to labor on the family's land in exchange for housing, food, and a share of the harvest. But the fine print told a different story. The workers were charged for their tools, their lodging, their food, even the seeds they planted. Interest accumulated monthly. If they failed to meet production quotas, penalties were added. If they tried to leave before paying their debts, they could be arrested for breach of contract and imprisoned. It was slavery in everything but name. Among the contracts, Helen found Eliza's. Dated 1867, when she was just 9 years old, the document listed her as the property of the estate, not as an enslaved person, since slavery was now illegal, but as a debtor. Her mother had died the year before, still owing money to the family. Eliza had inherited the debt. She was bound to the land until it was paid. Helen did the math. Based on the interest rates and penalties listed in the contract, Eliza's debt would have taken over 100 years to repay. She had been born into freedom and sentenced to a lifetime of bondage. Thomas was different from his brothers. The letters in the archive painted a clear picture of the family dynamics. The 2 older sons, William and Robert, were devoted to their father's vision. They managed the laborers with cruelty and efficiency, extracting maximum profit while keeping the workers trapped in cycles of debt. They wrote casually about beatings, about punishments, about workers who had tried to escape and been dragged back in chains. Thomas, however, rarely appeared in the business correspondence. When he did, his tone was detached, almost reluctant. He seemed to have little interest in the family enterprise. Then Helen found a letter dated March 1891. It was addressed to a law firm in New Orleans, written in Thomas's handwriting. The subject was debt contracts and the legal mechanisms for releasing workers from their obligations. "I am seeking clarification," Thomas wrote, "on whether a debt holder may unilaterally forgive a debt without the consent of other family members who share ownership of the contract. The situation is delicate, and I require absolute discretion." Helen's hands trembled as she read. Thomas had been planning something. Over the next several months, according to the correspondence, Thomas consulted multiple attorneys across Louisiana and Mississippi. He was careful, methodical, always emphasizing the need for secrecy. His father and brothers could not know what he was doing. By late 1892, he had found his answer. Under Mississippi law, a debt holder could forgive a debt if they acquired sole ownership of the contract. Thomas would need to buy out his family's share. Quietly, without raising suspicion, in January 1893, Thomas made his move. He told his father he wanted to invest in a textile mill in Jackson and needed capital. Cornelius, pleased that his youngest son was finally showing business ambition, agreed to give Thomas his inheritance early, including his share of the labor contracts. Among them was Eliza's. On February 14, 1893, Thomas signed a document that Helen found pressed between two unrelated letters. It was a certificate of debt forgiveness. Eliza was free. Freedom was only the beginning. In 1893, Eliza was 35 years old. She had spent her entire life on the same land, working the same fields, serving the same family. She had never learned to read. She had never traveled beyond the county line. She had never known a single day without the weight of debt pressing down on her shoulders. And now Thomas was offering her something impossible. Helen found the next piece of the puzzle in a journal that had been tucked beneath the labor contracts. It belonged to Thomas, and it covered the years 1892 to 1895. The entries were sparse but revealing. March 3rd, 1893. Told E. that her debt is forgiven. She did not believe me at first. Showed her the document. She wept for an hour. April 12th, 1893. E. asked why I did this. I told her the truth, that I have watched her suffer since I was a boy, that I am ashamed of what my family has done, that I want to make it right. July 29th, 1893. Father asked why E. is no longer working in the fields. Told him she is ill. He does not suspect. William and Robert do not care enough to notice. November 15th, 1893. E. and I have spoken every day for months. I did not expect this. I did not plan for this, but I cannot deny what I feel. The journal entries grew more personal, more intimate. Thomas and Eliza had fallen in love, a love that could not exist in the world they inhabited. If anyone discovered them, Thomas would be disinherited. Eliza could be killed. But Thomas had made his choice. January 8th, 1894. I asked E. to marry me. She said yes. We both know what this means. We will have to leave. We will have to disappear, but I would rather live in exile with her than spend another day in my father's house. The wedding photograph was dated February 22nd, 1894. They had married in secret, somewhere beyond the reach of Thomas's family, and then they had vanished. For years, Helen had assumed that interracial marriages in 1894 Mississippi were simply impossible. The state's anti-miscegenation laws were among the harshest in the nation, carrying penalties of up to 10 years in prison for both parties. Any minister who performed such a ceremony could be fined and jailed. Any witness who failed to report it could be charged as an accessory. So how had Thomas and Eliza married? The answer came from an unexpected source. While researching the family's history, Helen had contacted descendants of the Natchez black community, hoping to find oral histories or family records that might mention Eliza. One of them, a retired schoolteacher named Cora, responded with startling information. My grandmother used to tell a story, Cora said, about a woman named Eliza who escaped from a plantation near here. She said Eliza was helped by a white man who loved her. They went north to a place where they could be married legally, Illinois. Helen checked the records. In 1894, Illinois was one of the few states that did not prohibit interracial marriage. The trip from Natchez to Illinois would have taken several days by train, passing through territory where Thomas and Eliza would have been in constant danger of discovery. But they had made it. Helen contacted the Cook County Archives in Chicago and requested a search for marriage records from February 1894. 3 weeks later, she received a digitized copy of a marriage certificate. Thomas and Eliza, married on February 22, 1894 in Chicago, Illinois, witnessed by a minister named Reverend Abraham, who ran a church that served the city's black community. The photograph had been taken that same day. Thomas and Eliza had traveled over 700 miles to find a place where their love could be made legal. They had risked everything, imprisonment, violence, death, for a single piece of paper that declared them husband and wife. But the question remained, what happened next? Thomas and Eliza did not return to Mississippi. The 1900 census that Helen had found earlier listed them as residents of Adams County, Mississippi, with 2 children. But how had they come back? And how had they survived? The answer lay in the final pages of Thomas's journal. After the wedding, the couple had settled in Chicago, where Thomas found work as a bookkeeper and Eliza took in laundry. They lived in a small apartment on the south side, surrounded by a community of black families and immigrants who asked no questions about the pale man with the southern accent and his dark-skinned wife. For 3 years, they lived in peace. Then, in 1897, word reached Thomas that his father had died. Cornelius had suffered a stroke and passed away without ever learning the truth about his youngest son. William, the eldest brother, had inherited the estate and the family business. Robert had moved to Texas. Thomas saw an opportunity. He wrote to William, claiming that he had been living in Chicago for business reasons and wished to return home. He made no mention of Eliza or their marriage. William, who had never been close to Thomas, agreed to sell him a small parcel of land on the outskirts of the old family property, the same Victorian house where Helen would find the photograph over a century later. Thomas and Eliza moved back to Mississippi in 1898. It was a calculated risk. They lived quietly, avoiding contact with Thomas's remaining family. The local black community accepted Eliza as one of their own. The white community assumed Thomas was a reclusive bachelor with unusual household arrangements. Their children, Samuel and Grace, were raised in careful isolation, educated at home, protected from a world that would never accept them. The photograph remained hidden, locked in the leather trunk that Eliza kept beneath her bed. It was their secret, their proof, their promise. The fragile peace could not last forever. In 1904, a local newspaper published an article about miscegenation laws, calling for stricter enforcement against race mixing. The article included a list of suspected violators in the region. Thomas and Eliza were not named, but the threat was clear. That same year, Thomas's brother William made an unexpected visit. Helen found a description of the encounter in Thomas's journal, the final entry before the pages went blank. October 17th, 1904. William came today. He knows. Someone told him about Eliza, about the children. He stood on my porch and called me a disgrace to our family's name. He said I had 48 hours to send Eliza and the children away, or he would report us to the sheriff. Thomas did not comply. Instead, he gathered every document that proved his family's crimes. The labor contracts, the debt records, the evidence of beatings and illegal imprisonment. He wrote a letter to a sympathetic newspaper editor in New Orleans, detailing the system of debt peonage that had kept hundreds of black workers enslaved for decades after emancipation. He sent the letter on October 19th, 1904. The response was immediate. Federal investigators, who had been quietly building cases against debt peonage operations across the South, descended on Adams County. William was arrested. The family's remaining properties were seized. The workers who had been trapped on the land for generations were finally truly free. Thomas was never charged. His cooperation with the investigation protected him and his family from prosecution, but the price was high. He was shunned by white society, his name erased from local histories, his contributions to the investigation buried and forgotten. He did not care. In his final letter to the New Orleans editor, Thomas wrote, "I have spent my life trying to repair what my family destroyed. I do not expect forgiveness. I only hope that my children will live in a world where love is not a crime." Helen finished her research in the spring of 2024. She had spent 8 months tracing the lives of Thomas and Eliza, piecing together fragments of their story from archives, census records, journals, and oral histories. What emerged was a portrait of extraordinary courage. Two people who had defied the most brutal systems of oppression their society could devise, armed with nothing but love and determination. Thomas died in 1923 at the age of 67. Eliza lived another 12 years, passing away in 1935. They were buried side by side in a small cemetery outside Natchez, their graves unmarked except for 2 simple stones bearing their first names. Their children, Samuel and Grace, grew up to lead quiet lives. Samuel became a carpenter. Grace worked as a seamstress. Neither ever married. Neither ever spoke publicly about their parents' story. The photograph remained in the leather trunk, passed down through generations until it reached Dorothy, Thomas and Eliza's great-granddaughter, who kept it hidden until her death. Helen understood why. For over a century, the story of Thomas and Eliza had been too dangerous to tell. It challenged the comfortable myths that white Southerners told themselves about the end of slavery. It exposed the brutal reality of debt peonage. It proved that love could exist across the color line, even when every law and custom conspired to make it impossible. But now, finally, the story could be told. Helen published her findings in a historical journal that fall. The article was picked up by national media. Historians and genealogists began searching for other hidden marriages, other buried photographs, other stories of resistance and love that had been erased from the official record. Cora, the retired schoolteacher who had shared her grandmother's story, traveled to Natchez to visit Thomas and Eliza's graves. She brought flowers and a copy of the wedding photograph, which she propped against the stones. "You deserved better," she said quietly, "but you made your own kind of justice." The scars on Eliza's hands had told the story of her suffering. But the photograph told a different story, a story of survival, of defiance, of a love that refused to be erased. And now the world would finally know.